a true crime story. Hello, I'm Holly, the host of this podcast, Tell Me a True Crime Story. Welcome, and thank you for being here and spending this time with me. I truly appreciate you allowing me to be a part of your day. I hope that you and your family are happy, healthy, and safe. Big hugs to all of you. Now, let me tell you a true crime story. Rebekah Gay's trailer home was decorated with pumpkins and scarecrows. On Halloween, October 31st of 2012, Rebekah Gay was looking forward to taking her son, Conway, trick-or-treating, along with her fiancé, Aaron. But on Halloween morning, she didn't show up at the Goodwill store where she worked. Her co-workers were worried, and one of them went to her home to check on her. She wasn't there, but her car was parked next door in the parking lot of a bar named Barn Door. She was reported missing around noon by her coworkers. In October of 2012, John Douglas White had been pastor at the 14-member Christ Community Fellowship for the past 3 years. Pastor White asked the members of his congregation at Christ Community Fellowship Church to pray for a missing young woman, Rebekah Gay. Rebekah was 24 years old and single mom to a 3-year-old boy named Conway. Rebekah's mom was Sally. Sally was a member of Christ Community Fellowship Church and was engaged to Pastor John White. John White knew Sally's daughter, Rebekah, well. They were neighbors. They both lived in rural Broomfield Valley in the Broomfield Valley Trailer Park. And John often watched Rebekah's toddler son for her while she worked. The truth about Rebekah's sudden disappearance was horrifying and would very soon be revealed. No one knew John White was hiding a dark past and an even darker obsession. He enjoyed watching porn that showed women being murdered and acts of necrophilia. Necrophilia is the sexual interest in or sexual contact with dead bodies. Then Sheriff of Isabella County, Leo Medashewski, told the Associated Press that John said he was attracted to Rebekah and thought she was a very cute girl. For weeks prior to the murder, John White had been thinking about killing Rebekah and having sex with her dead body. As I mentioned, John White was hiding a dark past. Now we're going to rewind and go back in time 18 years. Vicki Sue Wall was only 26 years old when she went missing in July of 1994 from Kalamazoo County, Michigan. Friends and family had not seen her since July 10th, and she was reported missing on July 15th. 2 days later, her vehicle was found in the parking lot of a Meijer store on Gull Road in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Police obtained footage from a camera there that showed Vicki getting picked up in the Meijer parking lot at about 3 a.m. on July 11th by a man with a beard in a black pickup truck. The police investigation into her disappearance determined that although Vicki was married, she'd been having an affair with a man she'd met at work. His name was John Douglas White. He was married with 2 children and had another child on the way. 6 weeks after she went missing, in September of 1994, and 2 miles away from the Meijer store she disappeared from, Vicki Wall's body was recovered by a local resident. The man noticed drag marks on the side of a 2-track driveway and followed them. He soon came upon a white tennis shoe. The trail continued as evidenced by some flattened weeds. He continued to follow the trail made by the drag marks. Then he saw women's underwear. Suddenly, he smelled a horrible odor and caught a glimpse of a skull. Vicki Sue Wall had been found. Her body was naked, but there was a shirt and a bra around her neck. Her body was so badly decomposed, the forensic pathologist couldn't determine exactly how she died, but stated that the, quote, manner of death was suggestive of homicide, end quote. Investigators alleged that Vicky was pressuring John about the affair they were having. John White was arrested at the Kalamazoo Regional Psychiatric Hospital in September of 1994, approximately a week after Vicky Wall's body was found. He'd checked himself into the psychiatric hospital shortly after the day he was caught on camera picking her up from the Meijer store parking lot. Because of a lack of evidence in the case, John White was allowed to plead guilty to involuntary manslaughter in 1994. He was sentenced to only 8 to 15 years in prison. He served almost 13 years in prison and was released in 2007. Vicky Sue Wall was not John White's first victim. Now we're going to rewind the clock back even further from 1994 when Vicky went missing and her body was recovered to the year 1980. John White's first known victim was 17-year-old Teresa Etherton. In 1980, John White was 22 years old and married. Teresa was John White's neighbor where they lived in Battle Creek, Michigan. John White invited Teresa to his house to look at his racetrack in his basement. Without warning, he started stabbing her from behind near her shoulder blade. He stabbed her a total of 15 times in the back and chest. But thankfully, Teresa survived. And in a 2012 article by Ken Kolker of WoodTV.com, Teresa stated that John White said to her that day, quote, "I'm really sorry you had to go like this, but what the fuck, you're just a woman," end quote. John White was convicted of attempted murder. He was sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison. Calhoun County Circuit Judge Paul Nikolic also recommended he receive mental health counseling while he did his time in prison. John White appealed his conviction on grounds that his attorney had not mounted an insanity defense on his behalf. The Michigan State Court of Appeals ruled in John White's favor and threw out the jury's verdict. John White was not retried for the vicious attack on Teresa. Instead, he was given a plea deal. He was ordered to undergo mental health treatment and received 2 years of probation. His victim, Teresa, was not informed of John White's release from prison or his plea deal. No doubt Teresa received the shock of her life when she was standing in line in a state office and heard John White's voice behind her, the voice that had haunted her since she'd been so brutally attacked a few years earlier. She'd turned around, and there he stood, smiling. So that's who John White really was. He'd hid the truth about his reprehensible past deeds from his small congregation and his fiancée Rebekah's mom, Sally. He'd hid it from Rebekah, too, who entrusted him with the care of her toddler son. He'd nearly killed his young neighbor Teresa in 1980 and murdered his lover Vicky in 1994. Because of lax sentencing laws back in the day, John was let out into the world to kill again. According to John White's confession to police, after drinking about 4 or 5 natural light beers, he went to Rebekah Gay's home around 2 a.m. on Halloween morning. He walked into her trailer and a light came on in her bedroom. She walked to a side door where he'd come in, and that's when John White hit her on the head several times with a rubber mallet. John White said that when he hit her over the head, she said to him, quote, "I know you," end quote. He hit her until she lost consciousness. When he noticed that she was still breathing, he put a large zip tie around her neck and tightened it until she died. He then dragged her body into the kitchen and undressed her. He touched her naked body, but said he could not remember if he had sex with her body or not. He told police that he was unable to get an erection. All the while, her little son Conway was in his room sleeping. John White said he put Rebekah's body, her clothes, the rubber mallet, and bloody towels he'd used to clean up her blood in large construction trash bags. He placed the garbage bags into the back of his truck. When he did this, a bag ripped and some stuff spilled out. He dumped Rebekah's body in a ditch in a wooded area and dumped the rubber mallet and bloody towels about 1 mile away at the intersection of Pickard Road and Woodruff Road in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. John White threw Rebekah's purse, car keys, and phone in a dumpster at their trailer park, where they were later recovered by police. He then drove Rebekah's car to the barn door parking lot to throw off investigators and make them think she'd been abducted. He returned to her trailer home, dressed her 3-year-old son Conway in his Halloween costume, and drove him to his father. As part of their investigation, police interviewed John White and saw that he had a scratch on his nose. He said it was from a shelf falling on him at his home. Police ended up finding blood evidence in his home and truck and also a necklace in the back of his truck. John White was questioned by investigators and eventually confessed to killing Rebekah and dumping her body. Rebekah's body was recovered in a ditch on the southeast corner of the intersection of Coldwater Road and Pickard Road. John White pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and in April of 2013 was sentenced to 56 years to 85 years in prison. In the Michigan Department of Corrections, John White was inmate number 167505. He had been serving his time as a Level 4 offender at the Michigan Reformatory in Ionia, Michigan, when he committed suicide by hanging at 4:17 a.m. on Wednesday, August 28, 2013. Staff and EMTs tried to revive him but could not. John White was pronounced dead at 4:38 a.m. He was 56 years old. We're going to end today's episode talking about our beautiful victim. Rebekah Jane Gay was born in Midland, Michigan on March 26, 1988, to Thomas and Sally Gay. She was a member of the equestrian team and graduated from Bullock Creek High School in 2007. She studied cosmetology and was also a graduate of In Session School of Cosmetology. Rebekah had worked at Bo Rick's Hair Care in Shelby Township before starting work at the Goodwill store in Mount Pleasant, where she was recently promoted to management. Rebekah was known to her family as Becca Boo. She was totally devoted to her son Conway. Her mom said after her death, quote, "She said prayers with her son every night before bed following story time," end quote. Her online obituary described her like this: Rebekah enjoyed life to the fullest and was an inspiration to all that knew her. She was very family-oriented, caring for others before herself. She was a loving mother, daughter, sister, aunt, and niece. Rebekah is buried at Jerome Township Cemetery in Sanford, Michigan. Thank you all for listening to Episode 8 of Tell Me a True Crime Story. Please give the podcast a 5-star review and follow my social media pages. Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok are at Tell Me a True Crime Story, and Twitter is at Tell Me a TCS Pod. Subscribe to the podcast and tell your friends and family about it. In your settings, allow new episodes to be auto-downloaded so you don't miss an episode. I have another podcast I want you to check out. This week, I'll be releasing the 3rd episode there. The podcast is called All Available Units Respond, and it's on Spotify. Very soon, it will be available on all other platforms. Here's a preview of Episode 2 of All Available Units Respond. Do not be alarmed. The emergency tones and sirens you are about to hear are not real. Hey there, I'm Holly. the host of this weekly podcast about disasters and catastrophes. Welcome to episode 2 of All Available Units Respond. Last week, I brought you the tragic story of the Big Bayou Connaught rail accident. Please go back and listen to episode 1 if you haven't yet. I also want you to check out my other podcast, Tell Me a True Crime Story. It's a weekly podcast too, and so far it has 7 episodes. I thank you so much for being here and spending some of your day with me. I truly appreciate you. I hope that you and your family are happy, healthy, and safe. Big hugs to all of you. For the recounting of this disaster, I relied heavily on the report of the technical investigation of the station nightclub fire. This report was developed by NIST, which stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technology. According to their website, quote, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, was founded in 1901 and is now part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. NIST is one of the nation's oldest physical science laboratories, end quote. The station nightclub, located at 211 Cohasset Avenue in West Warwick, Rhode Island, was built around 1950. Through the years, it had changed ownership several times and had previously been a nightclub, a pub, and a restaurant. In 1972, the building was being used as a nightclub named Julio's. In March of 1972, a fire damaged the interior of the building, but the building structure remained. Since the contents of the building sustained fire and smoke damage, interior partitions and paneling were replaced. Although some of the structural framing was charred and smoke-stained, it was reported that it remained in the building continuously until the station nightclub fire on February 20th, 2003. Thankfully, no one was in the club at the time of the fire in 1972. The station nightclub building was a single-story wood frame building about 4,484 square feet with a flat roof. It had a small basement under the main bar room that was 1,794 square feet. The nightclub was not equipped with a fire sprinkler system. Inside the club, there were 12-foot ceilings. Facing the station nightclub from the outside, there were windows on the left-hand side, which were in the main bar area. There were also windows on the right-hand side in the sunroom. There was a ramp and stairs leading from double doors at the main entrance in the front of the building. On the sides of the building, there were stairways leading from 3 side exits. 2 exits were on the left side of the building, and 1 exit was on the right side of the building. The exits on the left-hand side of the building came from the main bar room and the kitchen. However, the kitchen exit was not really considered an accessible exit to patrons. The exit on the right-hand side of the building was near the stage area where the band performed. Entering the club through the main entrance double doors in the front of the building would have brought you into a short entrance hall. At the end of that short hall was a single door that opened up into the ticket taker area. Right beyond that, it opened up into the main assembly area that contained a dining room, the sunroom, the dance floor, and the raised platform that was used as a stage. Behind the stage was the drummer's alcove. If you're unsure what an alcove is, it's a recess in the wall. This just means that this part of the wall is built further back than the rest of the wall. Think of a bay window that juts out, the kind that some people use for reading nooks. It's similar to that. So those areas that we just talked about, the dining area, the sunroom, The dance floor and stage would be to the front and right of you if you'd just entered through the front entrance. On your left-hand side would have been the main bar room. Further beyond the bar room, walking toward the back of the building, on your left, you would have come to the kitchen first and then the dart room. In the back of the building were the office area and the bathrooms. The office area would have been to the left rear of the building, beyond the dart room, and the bathrooms were in the back center of the building, straight ahead from the main entrance door. At 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Thursday, February 20th, 2003, fans gathered on the dance floor around the small platform used as a stage. Others looked on from the sunroom area. Just after 11 p.m., the lights were dimmed. The band was about to take the stage. The rock band best known for their 1989 Billboard hit, Once Bitten, Twice Shy, Great White, began performing at about 11:07 p.m., opening up with their 1991 song, Desert Moon. Their tour manager, Daniel Beakley, set off 4 pyrotechnic displays called gerbs, or sometimes referred to as fountains. The ones they used that night were called 15 by 15. They emit sparks for 15 seconds, shooting them 15 feet into the air. Remember earlier I mentioned that the club had 12-foot ceilings inside? 2 of the gerbs spewed sparks straight up near the center line of the alcove opening. The other 2 were pointed at a 45-degree angle to the left and right sides of the drummer's alcove. It's still unclear to this day whether or not the band was given permission to set off the pyrotechnic special effects inside of the nightclub. The owners of the club, brothers Jeffrey and Michael Derderian, maintain that the band neither asked for permission nor was ever granted permission to set off pyrotechnics during the concert. The brothers also said there was no mention of pyrotechnics in the band's performance contract. However, the band said that they did receive permission from the club's owners. 8 seconds after ignition of the pyrotechnics, sparks from the angled gerbs reached the upper left wall by the drummer's alcove. Those hot particulates ignited the foam insulation. The foam insulation that ignited had been placed in the walls and the ceiling around the band area to help dampen the noise. The type of foam insulation used was highly flammable. A CBS News article online reported that according to former Attorney General Patrick Lynch, who investigated this tragedy, the foam insulation installed, quote, was equal to gallons of gasoline. It was liquid fire, end quote. According to 2003 models, the year that this tragedy occurred, the occupant limit for that building would have been about 420 persons. Approximately 440 people and possibly up to 458 people were inside the station nightclub that night. Investigators know from video taken that night that the first flames started just seconds into Great White's opening song. 11 seconds after ignition, the band noticed the flames. People in the crowd noticed the flames too, and began to realize that they were not an intentional part of the show. 25 seconds after the first flames appeared on the upper left wall, flames were touching the ceiling on both sides of the platform stage. The band stopped playing 30 seconds after the fire began. According to the NIST report, quote, the fire spread very quickly across the polyurethane foam, end quote. The fire soared across the walls and ceiling. Most of the crowd began to evacuate. 41 seconds after ignition, the fire alarm began to sound and the emergency strobe lights started to flash. According to a surviving witness, Linda Saran, inside the club that night, quote, "The foam was raining down and the flames are dripping from the ceiling. It looked like it was raining black fire," end quote. She also said, quote, "The bar got quiet because people were dying, literally, and all you could hear was the roar of the fire and liquor bottles exploding," end quote. Linda and her friend Deb knew they were quickly running out of time to get out. They went to a window and kicked at it, but it wouldn't break. An off-duty police officer that had been outside the window had heard the kicking at the window. He went to get a tire iron from his car, busted the glass, and started pulling people outside through the broken window. When Linda finally made it outside, she realized she was burned badly. Her hands wouldn't work. Then she noticed the black on her arms. She described her burned arms like this, quote, "It looked like a ladder of those black jelly bracelets from the 80s hanging in rings around my wrist," end quote. Another survivor of the fire, Phil Barr, was between the stage and the front door, crouching down behind some people in front of him. He said, quote, "You could not see your hand in front of your face. That's how thick the smoke was. Once you could no longer see, it was total pandemonium," end quote. People were trying to push to the front door. Phil had gotten to the club early in the evening that night, well before the club became crowded. Therefore, he'd had time to wander around and get acclimated to the layout of the club. He said, quote, "It became really clear that we were not going to be able to get out the front door," end quote. He knew there was another exit in the main bar room. It was further, but it was a straight shot to get to it. He went around the crowd of people trying to get to the front exit and into the main bar room. He was getting pushed from behind, and he tripped over what he'd assumed was a bar stool. He fell flat on his face. He explained that it became very difficult to breathe. He passed out. He could no longer hear alarms, noise, or screaming. He said when he came to, he felt burning on his face and excruciating pain near the base of his spine. He felt a weight on top of him. He said he was pretty certain he'd crawled out from under another person in order to get up. He ran across the room and ran face first into the wall. He ended up feeling the door and rammed his shoulder into it. He fell out of the exit door and down the stairs. He could barely breathe. His chest felt tight and constricted, and his throat was bleeding. Phil Barr was placed in a medically induced coma for 3 weeks. When he awoke, he was told that his lungs had been badly damaged. He spent 1 month in the hospital, fighting to breathe on his own, and had to learn to walk again. At 50 seconds after ignition of the fire, the ceiling above the alcove was fully involved in fire. At 11:09 p.m., less than 1 minute after the fire started, 911 received 3 cell phone calls from people on scene at the station. The information was immediately relayed to the West Warwick Fire Department, who assigned and dispatched Engine 4, Engine 1, Engine 2, Ladder 1, Rescue 1, and Battalion Chief 1 to the fire scene. At 1 minute after ignition, thick, black smoke came out of the sunroom windows. The smoke appeared to be at floor level inside these windows at this time. Occupants were escaping out of these windows. At 60 seconds after ignition, flashover occurred. I hope you enjoyed listening to this preview of my new podcast, All Available Units Respond. Please subscribe to the podcast and give it a 5-star rating to help it grow. Remember, it's on Spotify for now and will be available on all other platforms very soon. Big hugs to all of you, and tune in next week when I'll tell you another true crime story. Thank you. Bye-bye.